The title for the sermon today is Mission Impossible, should you choose to accept it. We're going to see the apostles go out on a mission, and it's going to be a mission that later in a couple of Sundays we're going to hear that Jesus says, and you won't accomplish all of this mission. So it is literally Mission Impossible. So we're going to dive in. After we've gone to Good Friday and Easter, we're going to get back on track with the life of Jesus. And the hear, see, do method of teaching and learning has been recognized for a long time as an effective method. You hear what you're supposed to do, you see it, and then you go practice doing it. And it helps you learn, and it's an extremely effective method that's been known for a while, and apparently it's been known so long that we can even find it in the Gospel of Matthew. Matthew knows apparently about the hear, see, do style of learning. As he lays it out, first, Rabbi Jesus, teacher Jesus, his inner circle of students go to the mountain and they hear his Sermon on the Mount. The foundation of this sermon is the Beatitudes, Christianity 101. Then these students see Jesus act out his sermon. We saw this in the 10 miracles of the valley. The physical miracles, though, are not the sermon acted out. It does no good if a random Gentile's child is brought back to life if they're still excluded. It does no good for women to find physical life if they're still marginalized. What we see in Jesus' miracles, after the hearing, what we see are actually unseen changes that Matthew brings to our eyes through physical miracles. So it has to be kept in mind that much of Matthew's physical references are metaphors to bring in front of our eyes unseen things. It's the unseen truth behind Jesus' miracles that are the acting out of the Sermon on the Mount. So the 12 apostles, they hear the words of the kingdom, and then they see the kingdom. And they will now continue their learning with their first doing. Jesus is going to send them out on their first missions trip. Apart from Jesus' mission trip, this is the first missions trip of the church. They're going to go share with others about Jesus and the good news of his kingdom. So we're going to turn to Jesus' modeling of missions that we can learn some important lessons from. He models missions for his apostles before he sends them out. And so as we come back to the life of Jesus, we last saw him as we finally wrapped up his last miracle in the valley. And he leaves the valley. And so as we come to Matthew 9:35, where Matthew begins his transition, we have this on a slide. In Matthew 9:35, we find almost word for word the same thing that Matthew used way back to introduce the Sermon on the Mount. And so Matthew 9:35 mirrors Matthew 4:23. Matthew has created literary bookends. It's for us to know that what we read from the mountain and through the valley is meant to be a section or a unit within Matthew's writing. In Bible speak, this is called inclusio. And so he creates these parentheses and he includes within it the Sermon on the Mount and the valley. He's given us these verbal parentheses in order to contain or to distinguish a unit of his writing. And later in history, we added chapters and verse numbers and now it's subheadings and all this other stuff. And often we can lose the divisions that the author meant for us to see. And so we connect with Matthew's intent when we realize these two verses regardless of how we've chopped up the Bible, these two verses are meant to highlight what Matthew wants to highlight. So we come to Matthew 9:35 to see Jesus now as the first traveling evangelist or missionary. First, Jesus went about. There's key verbs in here, and the first is went. And so we consider, well, how does Jesus go about? How did he went about? Past tense. He walked. The Greek word translated went in this passage includes the idea of walking. In fact, it includes the idea of kind of meandering at a walk. Jesus meanders about on his mission work at 3 miles per hour. This is the average walking speed. And he meanders, ending up wherever his heart and feet take him. Even with the end drawing near. Jesus knows what's coming. His heart is breaking over Jerusalem as John the Baptist knew what was coming. John the Baptist said, the axe right now is laid at the foot of this tree of Israel. Things are about to happen. Even as the end is drawing near, Jesus is still at work at 3 miles per hour. This is a great example for Stress Awareness Month. Often the church as a whole has lost its head in the sense of a rush to save everybody in the face of the next impending doom. But Jesus offers us insight as to how he faces even impending doom. It is still slow, it is patient, and it's loving. Because when I rush, when I feel stressed and harried, I often do things poorly. I often become a sledgehammer, trying to just get things done in the urgency of things. And as I'm in a rush, I lose the time to love and truly get to know people. I lose the chance to speak to them personally and to hear from them personally of their needs and the issues they're facing. And when I'm in a rush, I don't take the time to come and learn if or when times are actually right to say something. I just say things because they have to get out in my sense of urgency. In the rush, the pressure of the agenda will loom over the speed of love. For Jesus, it seems that no matter the gravity of what he sees lying ahead, he will still move at the constant speed of love. 3 miles per hour. This is the pace that takes the time to get to know people, invest in people, and make people the priority. We see further the priority by Jesus of the person rather than the numbers. When we realize that Jesus goes to cities and villages. If numbers was the focus, stay in the cities. Stay where you will get the bigger return on your investment numerically. But Jesus goes anywhere people are and wherever his feet take him. And he shows that missions, evangelism, is about quality over quantity. So Jesus walks about. Then what does he do? He goes to their synagogues. This is the place where people are going in order to seek religion, in order to connect with God. Aside from the occasions when people come to him and bring up religion, we'll find that Jesus does not model an evangelism that is typical of modern street evangelism today. It's not typical of those who use bullhorns, signs on the street that they hold with Bible verses, and other techniques that accost people's eyes and ears as people simply try to go about their day. Aside from the synagogues, the other places where we see Jesus go preach is a hillside out of the way where people get to go choose to come hear him. He preaches in the houses where he is invited. We'll never find Jesus setting up his soapbox to preach on a random street corner. Jesus' ministry lives out the prophecy of Isaiah 42:2. This prophecy says that when Jesus comes, he will not go shouting through the streets. Jesus models an approach that is both personally respectful to others. It's respectful in both the pace at which he works and the places where he chooses to work. The apostles will go on to continue this model of ministry, the Jesus model. Time and again, Scripture will place the teaching and preaching of Jesus and the apostles in the places of religion and the places of invitation. It never takes place just on a random street corner. As Jesus is conducting his evangelism, he also heals every sickness and disease. We read of the 10 cases of Jesus' miracles, which included healings. And many of these do take place on the streets. So while Jesus doesn't preach at people on the streets, Jesus will meet the needs of people wherever they are. Matthew's original readers, seeing the bubble of inclusio that is held between these two verses, they would have realized we have just been introduced to the dual ministry of Jesus. He introduces the kingdom from the Sermon on the Mount, and he touches people in the pain, in the valley. And Matthew is now saying that Jesus has taken these two parts of his ministry from the conjoined mountain and valley, and he begins to carry them across the region. As he does, he sees the crowds flocking to him. Scripture tells us that because he saw their need, he saw their hurt, he saw their desire, he had compassion on them because they were suffering and helpless. Scripture says they were like sheep without a shepherd. The picture is of people who are grabbing onto something, and then the next thing, and then the next thing, just wandering. It's the image of a flock that goes to the next salvation figure. And when that one lets them down, they go seek the next salvation figure, and the next one, and the next one. And Jesus sees the state of these people, that they flock to the next great thing that pops up because there's no one to guide them and ground them in just a direction. Most Bibles will read in English that Jesus has compassion for these people. But the Greek word here is that Jesus' gut is in knots for them. If you've ever felt something so strongly that it goes beyond your head and it twists and clenches in your gut, this is how strongly Jesus feels for the people who need something. He connects to their suffering and has compassion on them, is what many English translations say. Our English word compassion comes from the Latin words that mean to suffer with. Jesus shows himself, just like we looked at on Good Friday, to be the co-suffering God. He plugs into the pain around him. He's not, as there was a movement of deism back, it would have been even before America was birthed as a nation and everything. And they're still deists, but there was the idea of deism. That God is a clock winder God. He wound the clock and he sits back and lets it tick away. In Jesus, we don't find a clock winder God. We find a God whose own gut drops with our own. He's a co-suffering God. And in his co-suffering, it spurs on the mission of Jesus. The mission of Jesus, it will look to where lost people end up, which is generally dying in the woods. As we read in the news, lost people generally end up dying in the woods, and it will look at the lost people's ultimate end at some point. But Jesus' mission to help these lost people is not born from their future and where they may end up in the future. His mission is born from their present suffering. Somehow the church has flipped this too often. And the church very often founds its mission upon the work towards people based upon their future. As a stereotypical sales pitch goes from many in the church, you're eventually heading to hell. Let me offer you an escape for what's out there somewhere in the future. I think the church has largely, or possibly, gone to missions based on the future because it's less work for us here and now. If I identify someone's present suffering, and if my mission is to look like Jesus' mission, then I have to do present work. I don't push the solution out to the future. It's much easier to focus on a future problem than it is to look for the immediate issues and bring an immediate solution. You see, in Jesus, he sees the current problem that needs Jesus now. And he's told me that I'm his body on earth. So I'm the one that's meant to meet the problem that I see. So I have to do something now if I'm going to evangelize and run missions the way Jesus did. And it's more work than looking towards a far-off future. So Jesus is interested in the present suffering of overwhelmed masses. Secularly, they're an occupied and oppressed people trying to make life work as they live under a Roman government that takes more than it helps. Religiously, they are also an occupied and oppressed people. They live under a religious institution that asks more from them than it gives back to them. Jesus realizes the overwhelming task of ministering to so many overwhelmed people. So he tells his disciples to pray that God will send out the needed workers to gather in these suffering and wandering people. The ones who need the help now. And notice that Jesus, he doesn't say to pray for God to give the present workers supernatural speed to get the job done and reach everybody. Because there's only one speed in view. When you can only go at the speed of love. When you can only go at 3 miles per hour, the only way to reach people faster is to have more people working. Because you don't get to go any faster. So ultimately, as Jesus emerges from the valley and travels through the region, he demonstrates the Jesus way of Christian missions or Christian evangelism. It's the method that I believe we're to use to reach people with what we've come to hold as true. It's loving, it's slow, it's personal, and it's respectful. It doesn't impersonally rush things to an end goal. It doesn't accost people in their daily lives. And its mission is first born out of meeting immediate needs. And it offers a direction. It offers a reorientation for people who are simply wandering. But it doesn't pressure to a destination. It doesn't put people at sword point to get them across a finish line. It simply gives them a direction to start walking. I've come to believe that this is the model for missions work and for evangelism. And it's from this model that Matthew chapter 10 kicks off. Jesus is going to gather his disciples to send them out. And we have Matthew chapter 10, verses 1 through 4 on slides. And it's at this sending out that the 12 core disciples of Jesus become the 12 apostles of Jesus. Because the word apostle refers to someone who is sent out as a messenger. We saw this when we looked at Mary Magdalene. She became the apostle to the apostles because she was sent with a message to the 12, to the 11 at that point. This is the only time in Matthew's gospel that he will use the word apostle. This is the first sending of the 12. And we might call it actually the second Christian missionary movement because Jesus led the model one. He led the first one. And so here for the first time in Matthew, we meet all 12. Let's read in Matthew 10, verses 1 through 4. Then, after he had modeled the missions work, Jesus said to his 12 disciples, all right, team, huddle up. He called them in for a huddle. And Jesus gave them authority over unclean spirits to cast them out and to cure every disease and every sickness. These are the names of the 12 apostles. First, Simon, also known as Peter, and his brother Andrew. James, son of Zebedee, and his brother John. Philip and Bartholomew. Thomas and Matthew, the tax collector. James, son of Alphaeus and Thaddeus. Simon the Zealot and Judas Iscariot, the one who would betray Jesus. Jesus gathers the 12 and he builds upon what he just modeled with some final instructions before sending them out to finish their learning in their first doing. Jesus' instructions here turn into his second major discourse. There's 5 discourses of Jesus in Matthew, and remember, he's remaking the First Testament and making Jesus the object of it. In this case, he's making Jesus the new Matthew. He's making Jesus the new Moses. Start with an M. Jesus is saved while other children are killed. Moses was saved as Pharaoh ordered the killing of the other children. Jesus comes out of Egypt, just as Moses came out of Egypt. Jesus gives the law of the kingdom on a mountain, just as Moses gave the law on a mountain. Jesus' first explicit healing miracle is to cure leprosy. Moses is the first case of cured leprosy. And if Moses got to have 5 key segments of the First Testament, the 5 books of the law that are attributed to Moses by tradition. If Moses got 5 key segments in the First Testament, Matthew's going to make sure that Jesus gets 5 key segments of his gospel. The Sermon on the Mount was segment number 1. The instructions to the apostles is segment number 2. The instructions are going to break up into what theologian Bruner calls basically the 3 T's. And we have the 3 T's on a slide. The 3 T's of the instructions. They are travel instructions, trouble instructions, and trust instructions. The first, travel instructions, it divides up on the next slide into where to travel, how to travel, who to travel to, and when to keep traveling. When it comes to the first one, where are the apostles even supposed to travel? Where are we going? Jesus tells his apostles, you don't go to the Gentiles. You don't go to the Samaritans. You go to the Jews. You go to the ones who are in what Jesus calls the house of Israel. This is an interesting contrast to a God who we have considered came from the outside. He came from the outside in, breaking barriers down. Jesus doesn't have his apostles do the same. There's a few lessons that I believe can be taken from this, but the one that stood out to me this week, it goes along with Jesus' 3 mile per hour, patient speed of love. Jesus has come crashing in through the walls of division, but he's going to ease his disciples out. Like a good teacher, he knows how ready his students are. And he expects from his students nothing more than their own 3 mile per hour work. This is all God asks of any of us. Because to move more than 3 miles per hour is to move faster than God. By the end of Matthew, Jesus' students will be ready to hear the mission to the world. But moving at 3 miles per hour, Jesus knows my students aren't there yet. We start slow. So for now, Jesus says we're going to start here. We will journey at 3 miles per hour among the people and the places that you already know. Besides, change begins at home. It begins at home before it can effectively go out anywhere else. And so Jesus says, how convenient. You're only ready for this, but this is where it needs to start anyway. Having told them where to travel, Jesus now tells them how to travel. They are to carry the message of the good news that the kingdom of heaven is at hand, while they also are to touch people's lives with the power that Jesus has given them. They are not to withhold the message or the touching of people in their suffering. They are not to withhold it behind a cost, behind a charge, because the apostles were given the message and the healing for free. So Jesus says, don't charge for what you got for free. Don't put it behind modern vernacular, would be a paywall. You try to go read something in the New York Times and you bump up against a paywall. You got to pay us to see this, to read this. And Jesus says there is no paywall for this. We will see that later on he says people can feed you, people can take care of you, people can help you out. But you don't make that a requirement. You let people move as their hearts are moved to help you. So he says you don't get a charge for this. This is to be given with no expectation of any repayment. And in fact, Jesus says, you don't get to put a cost on this, and you don't get to take money for your wallet. Many translations say for their belt. They would have a belt and they would fold their coins up in their belt, but it was basically their wallet. He says, you don't get to have money in your wallet when you're going on this trip. And then we get to this interesting problem that people have wrestled with. We come to what appears to be a contradictory account between the Gospels of what Jesus says to take and not take on the apostles' first mission. And so we're going to look at the difference between the Gospel of Matthew and the Gospel of Mark. The first Bible college I attended, they were absolute literalists. And they struggled with this. And they had their own ideas of how to resolve this. And what we find in the Matthew account, Jesus tells his apostles they are not only to go without money, but without a bag, without a change of clothes, without sandals, and without a staff to walk with. But in Mark, Jesus tells his apostles that they are not only to go without money, they're not to take a bag, not to take a change of clothes, but Mark tells them to take a staff, to wear sandals. As we look at the issue closer, it doesn't make sense that you are forbidden from wearing sandals and not have a walking stick. These are two essentials for a walking journey, for a population that primarily walked anywhere, everywhere. A journey without anything on your feet and a journey without the support of a staff would be a non-starter. So we're going to look at this more deeply, keeping in mind that Matthew is all about metaphors. So what meets our eye is not always what we're meant to truly take away from the reading. In Mark, Jesus tells his apostles to take two items that are necessary to start the journey. But he requires that they leave the things behind that facilitate a continued journey. It makes sense in Mark. He tells the apostles not to take money, a bag for supplies, or a change of clothes, because this leaves you dependent to trust on God and the charity of others for what you need to sustain your mission. Mark makes sense. So what are we going to make of Matthew? The kids will come back here in a couple of moments as we close with a few minutes tackling this issue. We know that things in Matthew are being told to us for a deeper lesson than what appears at face value. So what deeper lesson are we looking for? In Matthew, a miracle about a leper being healed is not literally a miracle about a leper being healed. In Matthew, Jesus simply literally getting dunked in some water is not literally just Jesus being dunked in water. For Matthew, one person being freed from the forces of evil is not literally just one person being freed, but two parties coming to freedom from the forces of evil. Between Matthew and Mark, this is not a conflict of literalism, because we've seen that Matthew's gospel is to be read much deeper than just literally. It's not concerned to stay within the bounds of literalism because he paints pictures to convey meaning that other gospels tell us literally. Matthew doesn't want us to have just the facts. He wants us to have the deeper theology. So as we carry onto this list, we look at four specific items: the bag, the change of clothes, the sandals, and the staff. These specific four items are listed in ancient rabbinic writings as the four things that you commonly take on a trip. These are the core things that rabbinic literature says this is what you take. If you're going on a trip, this is what is customary. This is what is known as what you take. So when Jews, whom Matthew is specifically writing to, they hear that Jesus is sending the apostles on a trip, these 4 items would automatically pop into their head. These are the things that you take on a trip. This is what tradition says you carry with you. When Jesus, in Matthew's gospel, says that the apostles are not to take any of these things, the metaphor is that there is nothing common about the journey the apostles are about to undertake. The journey is so entirely different from anything they have known that nothing from the old traditional way of traveling is to come along. You are not to bring the old stuff on this mission. So remember, Jesus has come with his new thing that we've already learned does not pair with and does not fit in the old. Up until now, the apostles have been watching and listening to Jesus carry the new thing. But now Jesus is about to introduce the apostles into carrying this new thing for themselves. So remember that Matthew uses seen things to reference unseen things. Seeing leprosy cured is the removal of an unseen barrier of social and religious institutions. Seeing Jesus restore physical life to a young girl is to see the unseen spiritual life brought to people. So likewise, Jesus' reference to physical things that the apostles are to leave behind is the metaphor for the unseen things the apostles are to leave behind. Jesus tells the apostles that they must give up every single assumed physical ingredient that tradition has assigned to what makes a physical journey. This is metaphor for Jesus telling his apostles that as they carry the new unseen thing, this kingdom of God, this spiritual thing, they cannot pack with them the old assumptions and the old beliefs to which the new thing cannot be paired or fit into. Matthew's pervasive metaphors, they continue here as he records Jesus using metaphor to teach the apostles how to carry what Jesus has so far been carrying. Jesus is not literally telling them they will go shoeless on this journey. Literally, Mark is right. The apostles get to take their sandals and they get to take their walking stick. But metaphorically, Matthew dives to a much deeper truth, a much deeper lesson than just the facts. He says your entire old packing list, the assumed packing list that you carry with you on spiritual journeys, you don't get to take that along. That doesn't belong on a journey with this new thing. Jesus is really saying your entire old ways of thinking don't get to come with this new thing. The old and the new don't belong together. Nate's going to come close us in a last song of worship as we end on this note, as we end on this note of leaving the old things behind. Jesus eradicates and refutes the spiritual packing list that would automatically pop into our minds of old ways of the religion that his apostles had grown up in. Paul describes the same idea. Paul describes it as the renewing of our mind. Paul says the old ways of thinking are to be left behind when you journey with the new thing of Jesus. So Matthew's painting a picture for us of what Paul says explicitly, literally. Leave the old things behind and work on coming into the new thing of Jesus. It's so much easier said than done. As we continue on through the life of Jesus, we will see that the apostles struggle to do this. And so do I. I don't think I'm alone on that. carrying old things when Jesus says move into the new. Leave those things behind. So as Nate plays this last song of worship, I'm just led to consider, and I invite you to consider, what things do you still find yourself packing with you each day that Jesus says, leave those things behind? It's easier said than done, but consider it. Are you packing anxiety? When you get out to head on your daily journey to work, do you bring frustration with you? Do you make sure that's in your bag? Is it anger? Is it fear? Is it hurt? Is it depression? What's on your packing list for your common daily journey? That Jesus says, when you're carrying my new thing, you leave those behind.